That's unthinkable to me. That you have an opportunity in your lifetime to be a professional, that you think about quitting. See, you don't quit it, and you don't quit in sports. You retire. You don't get to quit. It's not an option. See, someone told me that a long time ago. That ain't even an option. And the person told me that, he ain't here anymore. He died. This is what's great about sports. This is what the greatest thing about sports is. You play to win the game. Hello? You play to win the game. You don't play to just play it. That's the great thing about sports. You play to win. And I don't care if you don't have any wins. You go play to win. When you start telling me it doesn't matter, then retire. Get out.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Randall Handles Football Podcast. I'm your host, Randall Tevis. Now, today we're going to have a very special Randall Handles Fantasy Football show starring the top 10 in wide receivers and tight ends from last season, as well as my upcoming projections for this coming season. Again, all of this in assumption that there actually will be a season, a 2020 season. You know, due to the COVID-19 and everything that's happening, it still would not surprise me in the least amount if it turns out that we do not actually have a season. So with fingers crossed and hoping everything goes well, here is my projections for this coming season. Again, today we're just going to focus on the wide receivers and tight ends from last season and for this upcoming season. So last season, we saw Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints set an NFL record with the most receptions in a single season in NFL history. He broke Marvin Harrison's record back from 2002, I believe it was, when he was with the Indianapolis Colts and, of course, teaming up with Peyton Manning. So, of course, Michael Thomas with the Drew Brees, they set a record with 149 receptions last season, and he was clear-cut above and beyond the best wide receiver in the NFL last season. The biggest knock, if there is a single knock on Michael Thomas, is that he's not a complete route runner, in the sense that, you know, a lot of his work is done in the intermediate range, between the 1 to 10 yard range. A lot of comebacks, a lot of slants, a lot of, you know, dig routes, a lot of those kinds of things is where Michael Thomas does a lot of his damage. You don't often see him going vertical, you know, going on a fly route or on a post route, anything like that. And so, you know, I think a lot of these numbers are skewed a little bit for his favor. Now, that's not to take anything away from him. That's not to say that all these other receivers aren't doing the same thing. It's just this is where he primarily is. And now, of course, with the addition of Emmanuel Sanders to the New Orleans Saints, I don't think that Michael Thomas is going to have a repeat of last season's production. I still do have him as a top 5 wide receiver in the NFL. And so to actually see where it is that I rank him, stay tuned. So last season, in terms of total fantasy value, Michael Thomas had 374.6 points in 16 games played. Now, this was almost about 100 points better than the next closest wide receiver. The number 2 wide receiver from last season was Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In 14 games last season, Chris Godwin put up 276.1 points in total fantasy value. Now, Chris Godwin is kind of the opposite of what Michael Thomas did, where he does a lot of those vertical routes, a lot of those posts, and a lot of those fly routes. He was one of the leading wide receivers in terms of yardage, and that's what puts him so high on this list. The number 3 wide receiver from last season was Julio Jones of the Atlanta Falcons. Julio Jones, you know, again, had another stellar season last season where he almost had 100 receptions, again, for almost 1,400 yards. So Julio Jones was the number 3 wide receiver from last season when he put up 274.1 points in total fantasy value through 15 games. Now, the number 4 wide receiver comes as a bit of a surprise. At least it was a bit of a surprise when I saw this. You know, I think there was a reason why the Los Angeles Rams felt that they could and needed to trade away Brandon Cooks from their team. So the number 4 wide receiver from last season was Cooper Kupp. That's right, a wide receiver who does most of his damage from the slot slots in at number 4. So Cooper Kupp, through 15 games last season, put up 270.5 points in total fantasy value. He was good for 94 receptions, 1,100 yards, and 10 touchdowns. It's his 10 touchdowns that really boosted his fantasy value and his fantasy production. The number 5 wide receiver from last season, I think, is going to have even more of a breakout year this season. That's DeAndre Hopkins. Now, Hopkins, of course, we all know in the offseason, came over from the Houston Texans and is now with the Arizona Cardinals. Okay, in the Houston Texans, he was the main man. He was Deshaun Watson's best friend. Of course, they didn't go to school together, but both of these players both went to Clemson University, so they have a lot of history together. So my number 5 wide receiver, DeAndre Hopkins, was good for 268.54 points in total fantasy value, and that was good for over 100 receptions, 1,100 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Now, I expect his yardage and his touchdown numbers to only increase this coming season. I'm expecting big things from Kyler Murray and that Cardinals offense. Like I've said before, I think Kyler Murray is a sleeper MVP pick. And with the addition of DeAndre Hopkins, it's going to be a scary combination. The number 6 wide receiver from last year is Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. Keenan Allen had another typical season last season when he goes for over 100 yards and 100 catches and 1,200 yards. In total fantasy value, Keenan Allen was good for 261.5 points in total fantasy value. The number 7 wide receiver from last season, Julian Edelman of the New England Patriots. Now, this is an interesting pick, because, of course, New England no longer has Tom Brady as their starting quarterback. It looks now as the quarterback of New England will be Cam Newton. Now, I think that Julian Edelman can be as productive as he has been in the recent seasons because Cam Newton is going to be the starting quarterback, but I wouldn't exactly count on it. And so I do see a step back being taken by Julian Edelman. The number 8 wide receiver from last season is Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears. Now, this is the kind of production that the Bears wanted out of Allen Robinson after they signed him to that huge contract after he left Jacksonville. Allen Robinson was good for 98 yards, 98 receptions, 1,100 yards, and 7 touchdowns. So Allen Robinson had 254.9 points in total fantasy value through 16 games. Our number 9 wide receiver, again, I think is a bit of a surprise, in Kenny Golladay of the Detroit Lions. Now, the only reason why I say this is a surprise is because if we remember from last season, Matt Stafford was out and injured for more than half of the season last season. So they relied on backup quarterbacks, Jeff Driscoll, and I think it's Bo Scarborough. No, whatever his name is, I don't know. We're talking about 3rd, 4th string quarterbacks that were leading Detroit Lions last season. And still Kenny Golladay slots in as the number 9 wide receiver. I expect his production to only increase in this coming season. I think that Detroit Lions have a sleeper, one of the top 3, have one of the top wide receiver combinations between him and Marvin Jones. So expect those numbers to only increase in this coming season. My number 10 wide receiver from last season is Devontae Parker. That's right, Devontae Parker of the Miami Dolphins put up 246.2 points in total fantasy value. Okay. Now, there was a lot of Twitter beef happening between Michael Thomas, the number 1 wide receiver, and Devontae Parker, the number 10 wide receiver, in this offseason. Devontae Parker claims that if only he had a Hall of Fame quarterback on his team throwing him the ball, he too would be this number 1 wide receiver. Of course, Michael Thomas says, no, it's not about the quarterback, it's the talent. Michael Thomas truly believes he is the best wide receiver, and it doesn't matter who's throwing him the ball, as evidenced by when Teddy Bridgewater was the quarterback. He was still putting up these gaudy statistics. So, there's going to be a little bit of beef between these two players. I'm interested to see what happens with Devontae Parker this coming season with Fitzpatrick and Tua Tagovailoa going to be the quarterbacks next season. So This brings us to my projections for this coming 2020 season. I'm going to go in reverse order, starting with number 10. My number 10 wide receiver from this coming season, he was a bit of a surprise that he wasn't on this list from 2019, and that's Tyreek Hill. Now, if you remember, Tyreek Hill had to sit out of suspension at the beginning of last season, so that kind of adds to it. But I think Tyreek Hill is an explosive wide receiver. Of course, he's in the best offense in the entire league with the Kansas City Chiefs. And with a healthy Mahomes, with a healthy Hill, and a full season especially after Mahomes got his mega contract, I think that Tyreek Hill is definitely good for a top 10 wide receiver. My number 9 wide receiver for fantasy value in the 2020 season is Adam Thielen. With Stephon Diggs now no longer in Minnesota, Adam Thielen is now the true undisputed number 1 wide receiver. Adam Thielen has been a fantastic wide receiver over these past 2-3 seasons. And so I expect that production to continue. He has a good relation with Kirk Cousins, especially on that play action pass. Look for Adam Thielen to be a top 10 wide receiver in the 2020 season. My number 8 wide receiver may come as a bit of a surprise. It's been a while since he's been on this list, but at the beginning of his career, he was known as a top flight wide receiver, one of the top 3 wide receivers in the entire league, and that is Odell Beckham Jr. That's right. OBJ, welcome back into the top 10. I have you at number 8 in terms of fantasy value for this coming season. Listen, I know the Browns really struggled last season. I know Beckham struggled. I know Baker Mayfield struggled. But I foresee a big turnaround this coming season. I think the Browns are going to shoot for one of these playoff spots. And it's really going to, the big difference is going to lie on how does Baker Mayfield perform. And, of course, if Baker Mayfield plays fantastic, that's going to only lead to both Jarvis Landry and OBJ having terrific seasons as well. So look for Odell Beckham to be a top 10 wide receiver in terms of fantasy for the 2020 season. My number 7 wide receiver, again, may come as a bit of a surprise, but I have DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks coming in at number 7. DK Metcalf really came on at the end of last season. He's shown, Russell Wilson has a lot of faith and confidence in him. At the end of last season, he was their true number 1 or number 2 wide receiver, him and Tyler Lockett. But as we know, Lockett does a lot of his damage from the slot. Expect Metcalf to really have a true breakout season, going up for close to 90 or 100 receptions and over 1,000 yards and putting up some touchdowns as well. He's 6'4". He's a good red zone target. I expect DK Metcalf to have a fantastic breakout season this coming season. My number 6 wide receiver for fantasy production in the 2020 season was the number 2 pick from last season in Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, you might say, oh, well, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have only improved at their quarterback position. Instead of having Jameis Winston, they now have Tom Brady. Well, yes, but a few things. Number 1, Jameis Winston, the Buccaneers last season were a throw kind of team, as evidenced by Jameis going for 30 touchdowns, 30 interceptions, and over 5,000 yards. Now, I think that just how Bruce Arians is, this is going to be an air raid kind of offense with Tom Brady at the helm. And so I expect Chris Godwin to still get his numbers. But the bottom line is he's still going to be the number 2 wide receiver of Tampa Bay. They still have Mike Evans, who I think, since he entered the league, has been, one of the top 10 wide receivers in the entire league. And so with that being said, he's going to split some numbers with Mike Evans. I have Chris Godwin at number 6 in terms of fantasy production for the 2020 season. Coming in at number 5 is Amari Cooper of the Dallas Cowboys. Now, the same kind of thing could be said about Amari Cooper as Chris Godwin. Amari Cooper shares a lot of throws his way with Michael Gallup on the other side. And now they bring in their a wide receiver they just drafted in the NFL in Jerry Jeudy. I think that's going to take away from some of his targets. But with what Amari Cooper does after the catch, I think he's a fantastic route runner. I think he gets a lot of those yards after the catch. I think he's going to have another good season. If we remember back from his early years with the Oakland Raiders, he really was a top 5 wide receiver. And so, he got his contract. He got his 5-year, $100 million contract. Dak Prescott will most likely be playing under the franchise tag for this coming season with another prove-it season coming his way. I think that, there's going to be a lot of numbers, a lot of passing numbers coming from that Dallas team. Like I've said before, I think Dallas is going to have one of the top scoring offenses in the entire league. Coming in at number 4, I have Chris Godwin's running mate in Mike Evans. That's right. So I have 2 players from the same team, both Chris Godwin and Mike Evans being, I guess, in this sense, top 6 wide receivers in the NFL. I just think Mike Evans is a little bit better than Chris Godwin. He has the speed, he has the height, he has the route running. So expect Mike Evans to be a top 5 wide receiver. Coming in at number 3 is DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, as much as it pains me to say this being a 49ers fan, I think that the Arizona Cardinals are going to push for this playoff spot. I kind of see a shift in the balance, a shift in power happening in the NFC West. For the last, 5 years, it's been the Seahawks and the Rams, leading the NFC West. I think this season, and at least maybe next season, it's going to be a change in the guard where we're going to see the 49ers and the Cardinals being the top 2 teams in the NFC West for a couple of years to come. So DeAndre Hopkins with the Cardinals, again, with Kyler Murray, I think it's going to be a potent combination. I have DeAndre Hopkins as the number 3 wide receiver in terms of fantasy production for the 2020 season. Now, number 2 and number 1 literally could be flip-flopped either way. I think they literally are the 2 best wide receivers in the NFL, and that's Julio Jones and Michael Thomas. Just for this list, I have Julio Jones at number 2 and Michael Thomas at number 1. But again, they could be interchanged, no problem. So I think those are going to be the 2 best wide receivers. What's kind of funny about this list is I literally have 4 wide receivers coming from the NFC South in Chris Godwin, in Mike Evans, Julio Jones, and Michael Thomas. So 4 wide receivers all coming from one division. That's going to be a scary division. I would hate to be a cornerback in the NFC South, but hey, they got a job to do. They get paid too. So again, that's my list for the 2020 fantasy production for all the wide receivers. Okay. So this brings us to now we're going to look at the tight ends. Again, tight ends are a bit of a different story. And what we consider a good season for a tight end is not nearly the same for a wide receiver. What's good for a tight end would probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 catches, 600 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And if we saw that kind of production out of a wide receiver, we would not actually, see them as a true number 1 threat. When it comes for wide receivers, we like to see 90 catches, over 1,000 yards, and probably somewhere about 8 touchdowns. Okay, it's not necessarily the same as a tight end. Tight ends do a lot of their damage in that underneath work, much as I said about Michael Thomas. They can be good red zone threats. Some of them do get high touchdown numbers, but they also do a lot of their damage in terms of blocking. And of course, blocking doesn't give you any fantasy value, but the truth of the matter is a good tight end is a combination of blocking and receiving. So the top 2 tight ends from last season literally go hand in hand. They're both, they're literally both the best 2 tight ends, hands down. I don't think anybody would argue that. But I think that, the top 3 tight ends in the entire NFL, they literally can be reordered anyway. So without further ado, let's look at the tight end rankings in terms of fantasy production from last season. The number 1 tight end in terms of fantasy value from last season is, to no surprise, Travis Kelce of the Kansas City Chiefs. Travis Kelce put up 254.3 points in total fantasy value over 16 games last season. He was good for 97 catches, over 1,200 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So like I said, that's literally the upper echelon, the top tight end. Doesn't quite get 100 catches, but still in that 90 catches and much of the same numbers that you'd see from a wide receiver. That's a true number 1 tight end, the guy who is targeted the most on this team. Of course, the number 2 tight end is George Kittle of the San Francisco 49ers. George Kittle put up 222.5 points in total fantasy value through 14 games. If you remember from last season, George Kittle did have a knee injury and an ankle injury. He did sit out a couple of games. He was hampered in other games. But even still, he put up 85 catches, over 1,000 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Again, we look at George Kittle as a true number 1 receiver. Even though he's at a tight end position, he is going to be the number 1 target in the entire 49ers offense. The number 3 tight end from last season is a bit of a surprise. He had never put up, these fantastic numbers before in his entire career. And that's Darren Waller of last season, the Oakland Raiders, but this season, the Las Vegas Raiders. Last season, Darren Waller put up 221 points in total fantasy value which was good for 90 catches, over 1,100 yards, and only 3 touchdowns. Of course, in the offseason, the Raiders did bring in Jason Witten. They did sign Witten as a free agent. He comes over from the Dallas Cowboys. I still think that Waller is going to be the number one tight end on the team, but still you can't count out Jason Witten taking away some of those targets. So I don't quite expect Waller to have the same breakout season that he had last season in this coming year. The number 4 tight end from last season, which probably really realistically, like I said before, there's a top 3 tight end list, and then it drops off from there. So this is in my opinion, the number 3 tight end, but he came in at number 4 last season, and that is Zach Ertz of the Philadelphia Eagles. Last season, Zach Ertz put up 215.6 points in total fantasy value, which was good for 88 catches, 900 yards, and 6 touchdowns. The number 5 tight end from last season had a bit of a breakout year for the Baltimore Ravens, and that's Mark Andrews of the Baltimore Ravens. Mark Andrews put up 207.2 points in total fantasy value, which was good for 64 catches, 800 yards, and a whopping 10 touchdowns. So a lot of his fantasy production came in the form of touchdowns. It's really hard to repeat those numbers from year to year as being a touchdown machine. So expect those numbers to drop off a little bit from Mark Andrews. The number 6 tight end from last season, Austin Hooper of last season, Atlanta Falcons, this season, the Cleveland Browns. Austin Hooper put up 191.7 points in total fantasy value, which is good for 75 catches, 700 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Now, again, Austin Hooper signs this contract with the Cleveland Browns. He becomes the highest paid tight end in the NFL. And after signing this deal, the former first-round pick of the Cleveland Browns, David Njoku, has requested a trade. So that does help out Hooper, but still, I don't think that Hooper is going to put up these same numbers as he did last season with Atlanta. Again, like I prefaced by saying, they still have OBJ, they still have Jarvis Landry, Nick Chubb, and Kareem Hunt, a lot of weapons. It's just not going to be that many targets going to Hooper. So don't expect this production to duplicate in this upcoming season. The number 7 tight end from last season, Jared Cook of the New Orleans Saints. In only 14 games, Jared Cook put up 43 catches, 700 yards, and 9 touchdowns. This was good for 167.5 points in total fantasy value. The number 8 tight end from last season, Tyler Higbee of the Los Angeles Rams. In 14 games, Tyler Higbee puts up 160.4 points in total fantasy value, which was good for 69 catches, 730 yards, and 3 touchdowns. A lot of Higbee's, numbers, statistics, and production came in the end of the season. And through the last 8 games, he really was the number 1 tight end in all of NFL. So, do I think that he's going to repeat this production from this to the next season? No, not really. But I think he has solidified himself as a top 10 tight end. It's obvious that Jared Goff does have some trust in Higbee. So, expect these numbers to relatively stay the same this coming year. The number 9 tight end, Hunter Henry of the Los Angeles Chargers. In only 12 games last season, Hunter Henry put up 150.2 points in total fantasy value. This season, he became a restricted free agent. He got the franchise tag, signed his franchise tag. So he is playing under the franchise tag this season with the Los Angeles Chargers. I think that, still the quarterback situation in Los Angeles is still a little bit unclear. We don't know if it's going to be Tyrod Taylor starting or if it's going to be Justin Herbert starting. And either way, I think that Hunter Henry is going to be a good, check down, a good safety valve for either of these 2 quarterbacks. And so I expect a lot of Hunter Henry's value to only increase in this coming season. And our last tight end on this top 10 list from last season is Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. This is the 2nd tight end of the Philadelphia Eagles, right? The first one was Zach Ertz, and of course now we have Dallas Goedert. I think that, I don't think that he's going to be another top 10 tight end. It was just the problem with Philadelphia last season is all their wide receivers got hurt at the end of the last season. And so they did go with a lot of 2 tight end sets, and, Carson Wentz throws it to his tight end. So in 14 games, Goedert produced 144.7 points in total fantasy value. Again, I don't think that these are going to be repeatable numbers. I don't think he's going to be a top 10 tight end next season either. So without further ado, let's look at our 2020. Let's look at my 2020 projections in terms of fantasy value for next season. And again, we'll do this in reverse order. My number 10 tight end in terms of fantasy value for the 2020 season is Kyle Rudolph of the Minnesota Vikings. Now, like I said, Stephon Diggs is no longer with the Vikings, so a lot of his targets are going to have to be shared between, Thielen and Rudolph and their other backup tight ends, Irv Smith Jr., Dalvin Cook, et cetera, et cetera. So expect Rudolph to return to his previous form and to become a top 10 tight end this coming season. So I have Kyle Rudolph at number 10. The number 9 pick for me is Tyler Higbee of the Los Angeles Rams. Like I said, I think a lot of his end of the season production will not be exactly reproduced, but he is definitely the number 1 tight end in Los Angeles. Goff has some confidence in him, so expect him to still be on this top 10 list. So I have Tyler Higbee of the Los Angeles Rams at number 9. Number 8 is a little bit of a surprise. He plays for the Miami Dolphins. That's Mike Gesicki. Now, Mike Gesicki is really just an oversized wide receiver. He has terrific speed. He has terrific hands. He sits at 6'6", about 260. So that's why he plays tight end. But, he's a great receiver. Whether it's Fitzpatrick or it's Tua Tagovailoa throwing him the ball, I expect Mike Gesicki to be a top 10 tight end, and I have him at number 8 on this list. The number 7 tight end I have on this list is Mark Andrews of the Baltimore Ravens. Like I said, I expect that his catches and yardage will probably remain the same, especially after they traded away Hayden Hurst to the Atlanta Falcons. That's just one less person that's receiving targets. They do a lot of 2 tight end sets, right? A lot of running the ball in Baltimore. And, Lamar Jackson loves to throw to his tight end. So I expect, those numbers to stay the same. I just see his touchdown production dropping off a little bit, which drops him to number 7 on this list. The number 6 tight end on this list, welcome back, Rob Gronkowski. Woohoo! Right? So, of course, Rob Gronkowski took last season off with the Patriots. This offseason, he decided to come back to the NFL and was traded to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Wow. So if we look at the Buccaneers, like I said earlier, they have Mike Evans, they have Chris Godwin, they have Tom Brady. Now they have Rob Gronkowski to add to that list. They still have O.J. Howard and Cameron Brate. A lot of targets, which is why Rob Gronkowski is not a top 5 wide receiver, but I will give him number 6 on this list. Don't expect the same numbers he used to produce in New England for him to produce in Tampa Bay, especially with all those other weapons. But he should still be good enough to get on this list, somewhere about in the ballpark of 50 catches, 700 yards, and 7 touchdowns, right? That'll put him on this list. My number 5 tight end in the 2020 season is Hunter Henry of the Los Angeles Chargers. I think given him playing under the franchise tag with a lot to prove, assuming he actually stays healthy, right? It was 2 years removed that he tore his ACL. Hunter Henry is a top 5 tight end, especially with these unproven quarterbacks throwing him the ball. He's gonna be a safety valve, regardless of what happens. So I have Hunter Henry as the number 5 tight end on this list. And I think it's pretty safe to say that so long as he stays healthy, this is where he actually is in terms of production. My number 4 tight end on this list, kind of along those same lines as Hunter Henry, so long as he stays healthy, he's a terrific talent. He's shown that he flashes his talent all the time. Just the bottom line is, can he stay healthy? And that's Evan Ingram of the New York Giants. Evan Ingram, when he actually does stay healthy, probably does slot in as the best receiver on that Giants team. Daniel Jones, he's going to give Ingram the ball. They don't have too many top options at wide receiver. So expect Evan Ingram to have a great year if he actually stays healthy. And then, like I said, these next 3 tight ends, this order can change in any amount. I believe that they really, truly are the top 3 tight ends in the NFL. No question about it. They're all good for at least 80 catches, close to 1,000 yards, and at least 5 touchdowns every single season. And that's number 3, Zach Ertz, number 2, Travis Kelce, number 1, George Kittle. I just put George Kittle on top of the list because I am a bit of a homer. But, like I said, any 3 of these tight ends could be swapped. And, in this order, it may change. Who knows. But top 3 tight ends in the NFL, Zach Ertz, Travis Kelce, and George Kittle. Okay. So that ends my rankings for both the wide receivers and the tight ends. Again, my number 1 wide receiver for this coming season is Michael Thomas. My number 1 tight end for this coming season is George Kittle. What do you guys think? Do you guys agree? Who do you see as the top tight end? Who do you guys see as the top wide receiver? Let me know in the comments below. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this special themed Randall Handles Fantasy Football Hour. Thanks for listening, and I will see you guys next time.
I don't care who you play, whether it's a high school team, a junior college team, a college team, much less an NFL team. When you turn the ball over 5 times, 4 interceptions, 1 for a touchdown, 3 others in field position to set up touchdowns, you ain't gonna beat anybody I just talked about. Anybody. All right? And that was a disgraceful performance, in my opinion. We threw that game. We gave it away by doing that. We gave them the friggin' game. In my opinion, that sucked. What's that? Playoffs? Don't talk about playoffs. You kidding me? Playoffs? I just hope we can win a game.